One of the last functioning medical facilities in northern Gaza is heavily damaged as U.S. diplomats make another push for a ceasefire. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo and this is The Heat. We begin with a new report issued by the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who is accusing Israel of a systematic campaign of forced displacement, destruction and acts of genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. The report is drawing criticism from Israel and the United States. Earlier, I spoke with Daniel Levy, who is the president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former Israeli peace negotiator, and asked him for his thoughts on Israel's long-term goals.
We have to combine a few things. Firstly, and most devastatingly, the report of Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, the comments of the UN Secretary General, are not plucked from thin air. These are based on well-documented research, findings, things in the public domain, and very often it's the self-incrimination on the part of Israel's leaders, security establishment, soldiers in the field posting. It's a remarkable thing to see this granularity of self-incrimination on social media, something that of course didn't exist in previous wars. When you put all this together and you ask that question, Anna, what does it tell us about Israel's aims? Israel has spoken about defeating Hamas, removing that threat from Gaza, but that's not the only thing it's talked about. And one would be hard put to understand the mass displacement of almost the entirety of the Palestinian population in Gaza. The destruction of almost the entirety of the building stock has been damaged or destroyed. Mosques, schools, hospitals, other educational institutions, public buildings, governmental offices, courtrooms. If one didn't pay attention to a bigger picture here, now it's true. Netanyahu has a coalition that is committed to, and it is open about this, the displacement of the Palestinian people, the resettlement of Gaza, the creation of a greater Israel. But it's not just his politics and his coalition. The entire government, in its official coalition guidelines, a signed document available for anyone to read, says that the Jewish people have the exclusive right to all parts of the land of Israel. So crucial to understand, this is a bigger political project which allows for no possibility of Palestinian statehood, but also not of Palestinian rights, of Palestinian equality. It is a broader philosophy that builds on a history of displacing Palestinians.
Right, and this raises, of course, the question of why there's been no serious international effort to stop Israel from doing what it's doing. You talk about this political project that Israel's also been on a killing spree in Gaza. 1/3 of the victims have been women and children. I mean, all we hear from the West over and over again is the fact that Israel has a right to defend itself. And even that, under international law, is questionable. The world's major powers have done very little, I'm talking mainly about the United States here, to stop the carnage, and in most cases are fully supporting it, empowering it, and enabling it.
Well, indeed, that right to self-defense is not the right to permanent occupation. It is certainly not the right to disproportionate and indiscriminate killing, as you said, 43,000 at least Palestinians killed. We don't know what is under the rubble of Gaza. We do know that, according to the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, arrest warrants should be issued against the Israeli leadership for war crimes, including the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And yet, more than a year in, when Israel made its intentions clear, very early on, it said this is what we're going to do. The president said there is no such thing as an uninvolved civilian population. In January already, Anna, the International Court of Justice, in a case brought by South Africa, calls for 6 urgent provisional measures to be implemented. Israel has ignored all of those. And yet, the arms continue to flow from the West, without which this didn't continue. This couldn't continue. The diplomatic and political cover of the United Nations. The narrative alignment of the US with Israel. We know about American domestic politics. We know that there are powerful, significant, well-funded lobbies in the United States on a range of issues, whether it's gun owner rights, whether it's big pharma, whether it's the Israel lobby. But you have to look a little deeper to understand this degree of integrating a support for a political project, which apparently is costing the US, because the rest of the world now says, wait a minute, don't you guys constantly tell us you're for international law, except when you're against it? And here's a dramatic example of you being committed to preventing accountability for international law. So if one wants to understand this, one has to understand not only the nature of the US-Israel relationship politically, but also that Israel apparently plays a role with and for the US, as the US sees it, in that part of the world. It wants to create a new Pax Americana with certain Arab states and Israel. That was part of the Abraham Accords. That's less easy today. It wants to be able to focus its attention on the Asia-Pacific, on the Indo-Pacific, and have its interests and the prevention of other parties having a role in that region, the prevention of a hostile, hegemonic regional power emerging by working with Israel. So this is also geopolitical.
And Daniel, when you talk about international law, and when we look at what is going on right now, doesn't this have implications for the entire system, the entire legal infrastructure that was put in place after World War II? And if we look at the situation right now, Israel has been accused of violating international law. The occupation itself is a violation of international law. It's been charged with war crimes, or accused rather, crimes against humanity, violations of international humanitarian law, and genocide. Hamas, I should add, has also been accused of violating some of those laws. Why has that international legal infrastructure that was put in place after World War II to prevent exactly what we are seeing right now failed so badly?
It has failed on that because it is not self-implementing. We have, as you acknowledged, an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice from July 19th that the entirety of the occupation is illegal, and that third-party state powers have responsibilities not to be complicit in these crimes. That includes the flow of weapons. There's a United Nations General Assembly resolution codifying that ICJ opinion, Resolution 12626. But if those powers on whom Israel depends in order to be able to conduct its criminal activity, to have access to global banking systems so that every Israeli bank can provide mortgages, can provide funding for the building of infrastructure illegally in the occupied territories, the building of homes, if it has that supply of weapons which it uses in violation of international law, if it is able to continue with these crimes because those who are in a position to hold it accountable resolutely refuse to do so, and in fact do the opposite, then there is no way to make actual the fact that these international conventions, the UN Charter itself, international law, is being violated here. And if I step back for a moment from the specificity of the Palestine-Israel situation, what this means for an already fragile international, institutional attempt to hold some kind of standards is that Israel's allies, Israel itself, the United States, have taken an axe to an already fragile international system and have basically swept it away in a year of horrors in Gaza and beyond.
And Daniel, one final point, and we just have a little bit of time. Do you have any hope that this will end after the United States election, which is just in a few days' time? In fact, both contenders have said that they would like to see an end to this conflict before whoever takes office.
And neither contender, of course, has said anything by way of what a policy would be that would look any different to the deeply compromised and complicit policy of the Biden administration over the last year. Now, that does not paint a very hopeful picture. Whether Netanyahu feels that he might be facing a different US reality, it is of course way too early to say. But I think the best we can say at this stage is that the US does not itself operate in a vacuum, neither domestically or internationally. So I think it will depend on the combination of pressures at home in the US and internationally that are brought to bear on any new administration. Clearly the Trump administration, when it was in office previously, had a track record of aligning even more closely with Israel. Clearly Kamala Harris was vice president during this horrible policy. But I think one should also look at other state powers and what more they can do so that this does become more uncomfortable, less convenient to pursue for whoever is sitting in the White House as of January 2025.
Daniel Levy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anand.
Okay, for more on the Middle East conflict, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Philadelphia, John Ghazvinian is the Executive Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Also with us in Washington, D.C., Michael Barnett is a Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at George Washington University. And Dan Arbell is a Scholar in Residence with the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Dan Arbell, let me start with you. You know, over the past year, we've heard some very tough language from Israeli leaders about this conflict in Gaza, about what's happening in the country. But it now seems that Israel is reassessing its goals in Gaza and possibly in the conflict with Hezbollah in the north of the country as well. The Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, who's regarded as a hawk, he's seen as a hardliner in the Israeli cabinet. He's made some very sober statements. Some may call it conciliatory statements about what happens next. Let's listen to some of what he had to say recently.
Not all objectives can be achieved through military operations alone. Power is not the essence of everything. To realize our moral and ethical duty to bring our hostages home, we will have to make painful concessions.
So, Dan, what is your assessment of what is happening and where this goes from here?
Thank you, Anand. I think that what we're seeing right now is in the last month, Israel has made some significant advancements and reached some significant achievements in Gaza and in Lebanon by, first of all, eliminating the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. This creates an opportunity with them gone, with Sinwar and Nasrallah gone, there's an opportunity to start perhaps new initiatives. And I think that what Yoav Gallant is right. I think what Yoav Gallant said is right. I think it's these military achievements by Israel, tactical achievements, need to be translated into more concrete, substantive, diplomatic, political initiatives, because they can go on fighting forever without a plan. And so I think that first and foremost, Israel needs to come up with a plan. And it seems that in Lebanon, there are serious discussions underway with the U.S. and other actors to get a ceasefire in Lebanon. And also, there have been negotiations that resumed between Israel and Hamas in Doha and in Cairo, and hopefully on a way to a ceasefire for a hostage release deal that will pave the way later for a more permanent ceasefire. So right now, I think that definitely there's more opportunity here to make diplomatic political gains. It all, of course, depends on Israel's political will. And there's a controversy whether Netanyahu wants it or not. We have to see where this goes in the coming weeks.
Michael, good to have you with us. I want to ask you about the resumption of ceasefire talks, which are taking place right now in Doha, that Dan mentioned a moment ago. The White House view is that the Israeli assassination of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, has now perhaps opened the door to some kind of a breakthrough in these negotiations. How do you see it?
Well, it's difficult not to continue my very, I guess, cynical perspective on all this. We've seen these negotiations go on for quite some time now. Whether, in fact, taking out the Hamas leadership opens up, as the previous guest said, new opportunities, I think is really to be seen. My sense, though, is that very much overhanging all these questions is not just simply a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, but it's also what is going to take place next. Because any ceasefire conversations have always bled into this question about the so-called day after. And I think what's become clear over time is that for Israel, that day after will mean very much a reoccupation of Gaza. We've seen from various Israeli settlement camps the desire to resettle parts of Gaza. There are indications, at least from the behavior of the Israelis, that what they want to see is a Gaza that's essentially the language of cleansed is a bit harsh. That's the language that was used in the recent UN report. But it does seem that in some way or another, this has been a decapitation strike by Israel with the hope that it will lead to the very, political, economic, cultural destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza itself.
Dan, a quick response from you, if you could, please, on what Michael just told us. On the day after, does Israel have intentions to reoccupy Gaza?
So what Michael said was he alluded to a conference that was held a week ago on the sidelines, on the fringes of the Israeli political system, although attended by some members of the Likud party. Yeah. But certainly this is not official Israeli policy, and also Netanyahu has vowed that Israel would not reoccupy Gaza and will not build settlements there. So, I think that of course, anything can happen, but I don't think it's a realistic scenario at this point in time.
Okay, John, let's look at the situation between Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah. Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati says he's optimistic about a potential Israeli-Hezbollah ceasefire in the coming days. Israel, for its part, says that it has seriously degraded Hezbollah's military capabilities in the south of Lebanon. But do you see something happening in the next few days?
Well, I think it's important to remember that no Lebanese government, particularly this Lebanese government, which is a caretaker government, one of the weakest governments that Lebanon's had in a long time, is in a position to negotiate a ceasefire with Israel without the buy-in of Hezbollah. And that path ultimately leads back to Iran. I think that the Lebanese government has found themselves in the middle of a situation that's much larger than they're really able to kind of deal with, not for the first time and probably not for the last time. Israel's strategy with Israel obviously feels right now that it's in this position of strength. It's been a long time since it's found itself having decapitated major parts of the Hezbollah and Hamas leadership at the same time. Iran seems on the back foot. We're still, of course, waiting for a response from Iran to the last Israeli attack. But I think that's the larger context in which this is taking place.
Right. John, do you believe that Hezbollah has been seriously degraded, their military capabilities?
I think that, I mean, that's a very good question. I'm not a military analyst, but I think that the sense I have is that these have been obviously major symbolic setbacks. Anytime you assassinate the leader and several senior members of an organization like Hezbollah, that's a huge win from the Israeli perspective. But
Right.
It's very obvious that Hezbollah still has plenty of capability. You know, if they had been fundamentally weakened or degraded, you would have seen them throwing everything they had at Israel in a sort of final act of desperation. And that's not what we've seen in recent days and weeks. We've actually seen Hezbollah making some, you know, interesting sort of targeted tactical attacks on Israeli military facilities. They clearly still have the ability to hurt Israel.
Right. Michael, there was another major development this past week, and that was a vote in the Israeli parliament to ban the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. It's a well-known agency. It's been around for decades. It's called UNRWA for short. It was an agency set up after 1948 to cater for the social, educational, and economic needs of Palestinian refugees. Incidentally, it also helped Jewish groups when it was set up initially. Now, Philippe Lazzarini, who is the Commissioner General, said that Knesset vote will worsen the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Let's listen to a little bit of what Lazzarini had to say.
Listen, this would be a total disaster. It's like throwing the baby with the water. This would create a vacuum. It would also feed more instability in the West Bank and in Gaza. The rehabilitation and the recovery will be made even much more challenging. Having UNRWA ending its activities within 3 months would also mean that more people will die in Gaza. There is absolutely no doubt about this.
So, Michael, what are the implications of banning UNRWA?
Well, they're symbolic and humanitarian. On the symbolic side, it's important to note that the Knesset bill said they would ban UNRWA within sovereign Israel. So UNRWA would not be able to operate within Israel itself, although the territories in the West Bank and Gaza, they would still have permission to operate. But essentially, they've been, for all intents and purposes, neutered. It'll make it even more difficult for them to operate. It's been almost impossible up until this point. The humanitarian situation, I cannot overemphasize the severity of it. It is really quite unbearable. I have lots of friends who, in the aid community, who have been in Gaza. They say they've served in other places as well, of course. They say they've never seen anything quite like it. They're used to being targeted by combatants. They've never experienced this kind of targeting, this kind of relentlessness. And so, you know, in this way, it's very clear that if UNRWA goes and is no longer to operate, it doesn't have the ability then to work as easily with other aid agencies on the ground. There's fear that the Israelis might, you know, further dismantle the Palestinian civil society organizations that are working on the aid, the Palestinian Red Cross. Everything's up for grabs. And again, this has to all be put into the context in which Israel has, you know, for the last months, has done everything to hinder the delivery of aid. And so I see this as part of a broader attack that's going against the humanitarian operation that is just ground to a halt.
Okay, Dan, Israel has made accusations in the past that UNRWA has been staffed by some Hamas members. They've provided no evidence, and the numbers that were mentioned were very small numbers. UNRWA, of course, employs up to 30,000 people. UNRWA was established by a resolution which was taken by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So banning it under these circumstances could be a violation of international law. Question is, why is Israel doing it?
I think this reflects the public sentiment in Israel, which has been very critical of UNRWA for years, but especially after October 7th, when employees of UNRWA participated in the Hamas attack on October 7th. And we have, there is information that came out about how UNRWA employees, individuals, are part of Hamas or cooperate with Hamas or carry out assignments, giving Hamas protection when they use UNRWA vehicles or UNRWA facilities and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the UNRWA leadership did not take responsibility, did not in any way do anything to address Israeli concerns. I think that the move is mostly symbolic, and I think that time will tell whether how much undermine actually UNRWA's activities in the occupied territories or in Lebanon or Syria. But clearly, it does reflect a public, Israeli public, frustration and anger how UNRWA is operating and how it's conducting its business.
John, I've just got a little under a minute left, and I'm going to look at the Israeli attacks against Iran this past week. Israel hit about 20 military sites. We understand that the country's air defenses were damaged, as well as ballistic missile factories that were hit. Iran is now threatening what it calls a, quote, definitive painful response. How great is the risk that we see another cycle of escalation?
It's a good question. I think that Iran is going to continue to exercise a certain level of restraint that may not actually match some of the rhetoric that it's been issuing. The fact is that Israel did a very good job of actually weakening some of Iran's defense capabilities. It managed to hit simultaneously some of its air defenses as well as targets in, of course, Syria as well. That's not an accidental move on the part of the Israelis. They're trying to make sure that they limit Iran's ability to kind of hit back. So it may be that Iran actually waits and bides its time, but perhaps even waits for a new American administration before actually acting its revenge.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.